The sun was a merciless hammer over the canyons, beating down on the rock and dust until the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat. Jedediah Stone guided his horse, Goliath, along the high ridge, his eyes scanning the unforgiving landscape. This was his kingdom, a self-imposed exile of stone and silence, a place where a man could be alone with his ghosts. He had come here to forget the world of men, but the world had a long memory. A flicker of movement below, near the dried-up creek bed, caught his eye. It wasn't the familiar rustle of a coyote or the slow amble of a lizard. It was something else, something human. He pulled Goliath to a halt, every instinct screaming caution. Strangers in this land rarely meant good news. They meant trouble, a commodity Jedediah had sworn off for good. He dismounted, pulling his rifle from its scabbard more out of habit than conscious thought. He moved with a quiet, practiced ease, his boots making no sound on the gravelly earth as he made his way down the incline. He found her collapsed in the sliver of shade offered by a towering red rock formation. She was young, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. Her dark hair fanned out against the red dust. She was dressed in simple buckskin, now torn and ragged, and a deep, angry gash ran along her arm, caked with dried blood. She was native, from one of the tribes that kept to the high plains, far from the encroaching towns of men like him. She was dying. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling across her face. Her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, deep pools of pain, but in their depths there was a spark of fierce, unyielding defiance. She flinched away from him, trying to push herself back, a low sound that was half whimper, half growl escaping her lips. He held up his hands, palms open, a universal sign of peace he hoped she would understand. "Easy," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." She stared at him, her gaze flickering from his face to the rifle in his hand. He understood. To her, he was the enemy, a white man with a weapon, the very symbol of the destruction of her people. The ghosts of his own past rose up, whispering their bitter counsel. "Leave her. This is not your fight. This is how trouble starts." He had lost everything by getting involved in the affairs of others. But he looked at the raw wound on her arm, at the parched, cracked lips, at the defiant fire in her eyes that was so close to being extinguished. He saw not a stranger, not an Indian, but a human being on the brink of death. With a sigh that was a surrender to a part of himself he thought long dead, he laid his rifle on the ground and unhooked the canteen from his belt. He uncorked it and held it out to her, an offering. She watched him for a long, tense moment, her eyes filled with 1,000 years of mistrust. Then, slowly, with a pain that was visible in every line of her body, she reached out and took it. He brought her back to his ranch, a small, solitary outpost carved into the base of the mountain. She was too weak to protest, lapsing into a feverish delirium on the slow ride, her head resting against his back. He carried her inside the cabin, a place that had not known the presence of another soul in 5 long years. It was a Spartan place, a testament to a life stripped down to its barest essentials: a bed, a table, a stone hearth, and silence. He laid her on his own bed, the rough wool of his blanket a stark contrast to the soft buckskin of her attire. He worked with a grim, focused efficiency he hadn't felt in years. He cleaned the wound on her arm. It was deep, inflamed, the cause of her fever. He fetched cool water from the well, gently bathing her forehead, trying to bring the fire in her blood down. In her fever, she spoke. The words were a torrent of soft, guttural sounds, a language as foreign to him as the surface of the moon. But the tone was universal. It was a language of fear, of loss, of desperation. He didn't need to understand the words to understand the story. Something terrible had happened to her. Something had driven her out into the wilderness alone, wounded and hunted. He found a small leather pouch tied to her belt. His first instinct was to leave it, to respect her privacy, but he needed to know what he was dealing with. With a pang of guilt, he opened it. Inside, there was no money, no weapon. There was only a single, perfectly crafted eagle feather and a small, smooth stone carved with the image of a swooping hawk. These were not the possessions of an ordinary woman. They were symbols. They held meaning. He gently retied the pouch, his mind churning. This was more complicated than he had feared. He spent the night in the chair by the cold hearth, his rifle across his lap, watching her sleep. The silence of the cabin, once his comfort, was now filled with her ragged breathing and the ghosts of 2 worlds colliding. He was Jedediah Stone, a man who had run from life, and he had just invited it, in its most wild and complicated form, right over his threshold. He had built walls around his heart to keep the pain out, but he was beginning to realize that those same walls also kept out the light, and this strange, defiant woman, a refugee from a world he did not know, had just brought a flicker of that light into his darkness. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and the low murmur of a voice. For a moment, she was back in the terror, the chaos of the attack, the screams of her kin and the thunder of guns. Panic seized her cold and sharp. She sat up, her eyes wide, her hand instinctively going to her side for a knife that wasn't there. The cabin was small, rough-hewn. The man who had found her sat at a simple wooden table, his back to her, mending a piece of leather tack. He was speaking, not to her, but to a large, shaggy dog lying at his feet. The words were in his own tongue, but the tone was gentle, reassuring. The man turned, sensing her movement. He was big, broader than she had realized, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the mountain itself. A pale scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a permanent look of severity. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, met hers. There was no menace in them, only a quiet, weary watchfulness. He said something in his language, his voice a low rumble. She did not understand the word, but she understood the gesture as he pointed to a bowl of broth on the crate beside the bed. She stared at the bowl, then back at him, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. He was her enemy. His people had brought nothing but sorrow and destruction. They had taken the land, killed the buffalo, and broken the sacred promises. And yet, this man had not harmed her. He had brought her here, tended her wound, and offered her food. It was a contradiction she could not resolve. She pointed to herself. "Ayana," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. It was the first word she had spoken since the attack, the first time she had named herself in this new, terrifying world. The man paused in his work. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He pointed to himself. "Jedediah," he said. The name was hard like the rock of the canyon. Ayana, Jedediah. 2 names, 2 worlds, trapped together in a small wooden box in the middle of a vast, empty wilderness. She reached for the bowl of broth. Her hands were trembling, but she managed to lift it to her lips. The warm liquid was life itself, chasing away some of the deep, gnawing cold of her fear. She drank, her eyes never leaving the man. He had turned back to his work, but she knew he was aware of her every move. This was a truce, a fragile, unspoken agreement. He would not harm her, and she would accept his help. But what would happen when her strength returned? What would happen when the outside world, the world of his people and hers, came crashing in on this small pocket of peace? The days that followed were a study in silence. Ayana's body healed slowly, the fire of the fever receding, the strength returning to her limbs. The man, Jedediah, was a constant, quiet presence. He would leave food for her, then retreat to his work, tending his few cattle, chopping wood, his movements economical and purposeful. He gave her space, a gift she valued more than any words. She began to watch him, to learn the rhythms of his solitary life. He was a man steeped in a profound sadness. She saw it in the way he would sometimes stop and stare at the horizon, his face a mask of such desolate grief that it made her own heart ache. She saw it in the 2 simple, weathered wooden crosses on the small hill behind the cabin, graves he tended with a silent, reverent care. He had lost his own tribe. The realization settled in her heart, not as a thought, but as a deep, intuitive knowing. His loneliness was a reflection of her own. The language barrier was a chasm between them, but they began to build a bridge, 1 small stone at a time. It started with gestures. He would point to the water bucket, and she would nod. She would point to the fire, and he would add another log. Then came the words. He pointed to the dog. "Dog," he said, his voice slow and clear. She repeated the word, her tongue clumsy around the unfamiliar sound. She then pointed to the dog and said her own word for it, "Sunka." He repeated it, a rare, fleeting smile touching his lips. It was a game, a simple exchange, but it was more than that. It was an acknowledgement. It was respect. One afternoon, she felt strong enough to walk outside. The air was clean and sharp, the sky a vast, endless blue. She saw him by the corral, working with his horse, a magnificent beast the color of midnight. He moved with the horse not as a master but as a partner, his hands gentle, his voice a low, calming murmur. She walked to the small garden near the cabin, a patch of struggling vegetables he seemed to fight to keep alive in the hard soil. She knelt, her fingers sinking into the earth. She knew this work. Her people were hunters, but they were also growers. She saw the weeds choking the life from the plants, the soil packed and hard. Without thinking, she began to work, her hands moving with an ancient, practiced skill, pulling the weeds, loosening the soil around the roots of the plants. He came and stood behind her, watching her. She did not need to look up to know he was there. She could feel his presence, his surprise. She was no longer just a patient, a stranger. She was contributing. She was bringing a small piece of her own world, her own knowledge, into his. And in the shared language of the earth, the chasm between them grew a little smaller. The first frost of autumn painted the high peaks with a dusting of white, a warning of the coming winter. Ayana was stronger now, the wound on her arm a fading scar. She had settled into a routine in the small cabin, a life of quiet domesticity that was both a comfort and a constant reminder of her precarious situation. She still did not know what had become of her father, Chief Black Eagle, or the rest of her people. The memory of the ambush, the sudden explosion of gunfire, the chaos, the brutal, bearded faces of the white men who had attacked their hunting party, was a nightmare that haunted her waking hours. She had run blindly, desperately, until she had collapsed. Jedediah, for his part, found his carefully constructed world of solitude irrevocably altered. The silence of his cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with her quiet presence. The scent of her cooking, simple meals made from his meager supplies, but with a skill he did not possess, mingled with the familiar smells of wood smoke and leather. He found himself listening for the soft padding of her moccasins on the floorboards, a sound that had become as much a part of the cabin's life as the creak of the logs in the wind. He was teaching her English, a few words at a time. She was a quick learner, her mind sharp, her voice soft as she repeated the strange, hard sounds. She in turn taught him words in her own tongue, words that were like music, flowing and natural. He learned that the sun was we, the moon was Hanwi, and water was Minni. Each new word was a small victory, a small act of trust. One evening, as a cold wind howled outside, he returned from checking on his cattle to find her sitting by the fire, a piece of charcoal in her hand. She was drawing on a flat piece of slate he used for calculations. He stood behind her, watching. She was drawing a story. She drew a picture of a great eagle, then a man with a stern, noble face, her father. She drew a line of people, traveling. Then she drew monstrous figures with beards and guns, their faces twisted with hate. She drew chaos, fire, and a single, small figure running into the mountains. Her finger trembled as she pointed to the running figure, then to herself. Jedediah's heart grew cold. He had suspected as much, but seeing it laid bare in the stark black lines was a different thing entirely. This was not a random act of violence. It was an attack, a massacre, and she was the only survivor he knew of. He looked from the drawing to her face. Her eyes were filled with a profound, unshed grief. He reached out, his calloused hand gently covering hers, stilling its trembling. He said nothing. There were no words in his language or hers that could bridge the chasm of such a loss, but in the simple, shared touch, in the quiet communion of their grief, they understood each other perfectly. The larder was growing bare, the coming winter would be long and hard, and Jedediah knew he could no longer put off the trip to the town of redemption. He hated the place, a raw, dusty collection of buildings filled with suspicious, small-minded people who looked at him, the lone rancher from the high country, with a mixture of fear and contempt. But he needed salt, flour, and ammunition. He needed news. He tried to explain to Ayana where he was going, using a combination of words and gestures. He drew a picture of the town, of the general store. He pointed to himself, then to the road leading away from the ranch, then back again. She understood. He saw the fear that flickered in her eyes, the fear of being left alone. "I will be back," he said, his voice firm. "2 sons." He made a motion of the sun rising and setting twice. "Lock the door. Do not open it." He handed her his spare revolver, a heavy, well-oiled Colt. He had shown her how to use it, how to load it, how to fire it. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she took it. The town of redemption was just as he remembered it. a single muddy street smelling of horses and cheap whiskey. He tied Goliath outside the general store and went inside, the bell over the door jangling his nerves. The store was filled with the usual collection of trappers and homesteaders, their voices a low drone of gossip. As he gathered his supplies, he listened. The talk was of cattle prices, the coming snow, and a recent raid on a stagecoach. Then, a name caught his ear. Black Eagle, one of the men said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the cracker barrel. His whole hunting party, wiped out. Serves him right for being on this side of the reservation line. Jedediah's blood ran cold. He kept his face impassive, his attention seemingly focused on a sack of flour. Heard there was a survivor, another man chimed in. A girl, his daughter, the one they called the Morning Star. She got away. Sheriff Brody's got the posse out looking for her, the first man said with a grim chuckle. Says it's for her own protection. More like he's afraid of what Black Eagle will do when he finds out his girl is missing in white territory. It'd start a war. Jedediah paid for his goods, his mind racing. Ayanna, the Morning Star, the daughter of a great chief. The danger of his situation crashed down on him with the force of an avalanche. He was harboring a political incident, a spark that could ignite the entire frontier. He stepped out onto the boardwalk, his eyes drawn to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody stood there, a big man with a florid face and small, mean eyes. He was talking to a group of men, a posse, and standing among them, Jedediah saw a familiar face. A brutal, bearded man he had seen on a wanted poster for the stagecoach robbery. The outlaws. They hadn't just attacked Ayanna's people, they were now hiding in plain sight, joining the very posse that was supposedly searching for her, ensuring the only witness to their crime would never be found alive. Brody's eyes met Jedediah's across the street. A flicker of suspicion crossed the sheriff's face. Jedediah gave a curt nod, loaded his supplies, and rode out of town, the weight of the world on his shoulders. The ride back to the cabin was a blur of grim calculations. The world had shrunk. The vast wilderness that had been his sanctuary was now a closing trap. He was caught between a vengeful war chief, a prejudiced town, and a band of ruthless outlaws who wanted Ayanna dead. Any rational man would have turned her over. He could ride back to redemption, hand her to Sheriff Brody, and wash his hands of the whole affair. It was the safe choice, the sensible choice. He could return to his solitude, his ghosts, his only companions. He crested the final ridge and saw the thin plume of smoke rising from his cabin's chimney. It was a beacon, a sign of life, a sight that had become achingly familiar over the past weeks. It was the sign of a home. He pushed Goliath harder. When he entered the cabin, Ayanna was there by the fire, the revolver he had given her resting on the table nearby. She looked up, her eyes lighting with a relief she could not hide. That look, that simple, unguarded expression of trust, shattered any lingering thoughts of self-preservation. He knew in that moment that he would not, could not, give her up. There was no choice to be made. The choice had been made the moment he decided to lift her from the dust. He unpacked the supplies, his movements heavy. "Trouble?" he said, the English word sounding harsh in the quiet cabin. He knelt by the hearth, and using a piece of charcoal on the slate, he drew what he had seen. He drew Sheriff Brody, his face cruel. He drew the bearded outlaw, his face a mask of evil. He drew a hangman's noose. He pointed to her, then to the noose. Her face went pale, but her expression hardened into a familiar, defiant resolve. She took the charcoal from his hand. She erased the noose. In its place, she drew a picture of him, a tall, strong figure standing before a small, running girl, a protector. Then she drew a picture of herself, no longer running, but standing beside him, a rifle in her hand. Partners. He looked from her drawing to her face. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a fierce courage. She was not asking him to save her. She was telling him they would fight together. A grim smile touched his lips. He had spent 5 years running from the fight, from any connection that might lead to pain. But the fight had found him. A lone woman with the heart of a warrior had dragged him back into the world of the living. "All right, Morning Star," he said, using the name he had heard in town. Her eyes widened in surprise. "All right," he said again, his voice a low vow. "We fight." The pact was sealed, not with words, but with shared drawings in the dirt, a silent promise to stand against the coming storm. They began to prepare for a siege. The cabin, once a simple shelter, was now a fortress. Jedediah boarded up the back window, leaving only small slits to shoot through. He reinforced the door with a heavy iron bar. He and Ayana worked together, a silent, efficient team. She seemed to anticipate his needs, handing him tools, holding boards steady. Her hands, he noticed, were strong and capable. She was not a fragile princess. She was the daughter of a war chief, and survival was in her blood. He spent hours with her outside, teaching her to shoot the rifle, not just the pistol. The heavy Winchester was awkward for her at first, but she was a natural. Her eye was keen, her hand steady. She learned to breathe, to squeeze the trigger, to become one with the weapon. He saw the grim satisfaction in her eyes when she hit the tin can he had set on a distant post. It was the look of a person taking back their power. In the evenings, the preparations would cease, and a fragile domesticity would settle over them again. They would share a simple meal, the silence between them no longer a barrier but a shared space of understanding. One night, as he was cleaning his rifle, she came and sat beside him. She was holding the small carved hawk from her medicine pouch. She held it out to him. "For you," she said, her English slow but clear. "Protection." He hesitated. To accept such a gift was to accept a bond, a connection he had fought for so long to avoid. But to refuse it would be an insult, a rejection of the trust she was offering. He took the small stone carving. It was smooth and warm in his callous palm. He looked at her, at the earnest sincerity in her dark eyes. He felt a powerful protective ache in his chest, a feeling he had not allowed himself to feel since the death of his wife and son. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He reached into the small wooden chest where he kept his few memories and pulled out a faded photograph. It was of a woman with a kind smile and a small boy with a mischievous grin. "My family," he said, showing it to her. "Sarah, Thomas." Ayana looked at the photograph, her expression softening with a deep, sorrowful understanding. She gently touched the image of the woman, then the boy. She looked up at him, her eyes mirroring the grief she saw in his. She did not know their story, but she knew their loss. It was a language they both spoke fluently. She reached out and briefly touched the scar on his eyebrow. In that moment, the last of his walls crumbled. He was no longer just her protector. She was no longer just his ward. They were two survivors, two lonely souls scarred by the world, who had found a strange and unexpected sanctuary in each other. The knock on the door came at dawn, sharp and loud, a sound of arrogant authority. Jedediah was already awake, sitting in his chair, his rifle across his lap. He had been expecting it. He looked at Ayana, who was hidden in the small, dark root cellar beneath the floorboards, a position they had prepared days ago. "Stay down," he had told her. "No matter what you hear." A voice boomed from outside. "Jedediah Stone, this is Sheriff Brody. Open up. We know you're in there." Jedediah took a slow, calming breath and walked to the door. He did not open it. "What do you want, Brody?" he called out, his voice steady. "We've got a report you're harboring a fugitive, a runaway Indian girl. We're here to take her into custody, for her own protection." "There's no one here but me," Jedediah lied, his voice flat. "Now get off my land." A harsh laugh came from outside. "Don't be a fool, Stone. We've got you surrounded. We know she's in there. One of my deputies saw her near the creek yesterday. Just give her up, and we'll forget all about this. Don't make us come in and get her." Jedediah glanced at the small shooting slit he had carved in the wall. He could see them, a dozen men, some in sheriff's uniforms, others the rough-looking men he had seen in town, and among them the bearded outlaw, his face a mask of smug anticipation. They didn't want to protect her. They wanted to silence her. "She's under my protection," Jedediah called out, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "You are not welcome here. This is your last warning." A moment of stunned silence followed his declaration. Then, Brody's voice, cold and furious. "Have it your way, Stone. You're making a big mistake." Jedediah heard the click of a dozen rifle hammers being pulled back. The siege had begun. He moved to the shooting slit, his own rifle raised. He was one man against a dozen, a lone rancher against a corrupt town. The odds were impossible, but as he looked out at the faces of the men who had come to his home, he felt no fear. He felt only a cold, hard rage. They had mistaken his solitude for weakness. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The first shot splintered the wood of the door, and the battle for the Morning Star began. The cabin erupted into a war zone. Bullets tore through the thin log walls, shattering the few precious items Jedediah owned, kicking up splinters of wood. He didn't return fire wildly. He was patient, methodical, a hunter in his own territory. He fired sparingly, his shots aimed not to kill but to intimidate, to make them understand that this would be a costly fight. He hit the water barrel near the porch, sending it bursting, a psychological blow. He shot the rifle out of one man's hands, the sound of the metal clattering on the ground a clear message. From her hiding place in the cellar, Aya heard the thunder of the guns, the shouts of the men. Every shot was a hammer blow to her heart. She was a prisoner of the darkness, helpless while the man who had saved her fought for her life. The smell of gunpowder filled the small space, a scent that brought back the horror of the ambush. But this time was different. This time, someone was fighting for her. The thought gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. Above, the battle raged. Jedediah moved from one shooting slit to another, a ghost in his own home, making his single rifle sound like an army. The men outside were growing frustrated, their initial confidence turning to anger. "He's just one man," Brody yelled. "Rush the door." But they hesitated. The quiet rancher they had all dismissed as a strange recluse was proving to be a deadly opponent. They had come for an easy prize, not a pitched battle. The hours crawled by. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Jedediah's shoulder ached from the recoil of the rifle. His ears rang from the constant explosions. He was running low on ammunition. He knew he couldn't hold them off forever. They would eventually burn him out, or simply wait until he was out of bullets. He spared a thought for Ayanna, hidden below. He hoped she would have the sense to run if he fell. He hoped she would make it to her people. He had given her a chance, and that would have to be enough. Just as a grim resignation began to settle over him, he heard a new sound, a sound that chilled him to the bone. It was not the sound of gunfire. It was a high, ululating cry, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself, a war cry. Ayanna heard it too. Her head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. She knew that sound. It was the war cry of her father's warriors. The war cry sliced through the chaos of the gunfight, freezing everyone in place. Sheriff Brody and his posse spun around, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning terror. On the ridge overlooking the ranch, silhouetted against the bright morning sky, a line of riders had appeared. They were warriors, their faces painted for battle, their lances and rifles held at the ready. At their head was a man of immense presence, his stern, noble face a mask of cold fury. Chief Black Eagle had come for his daughter. The posse, so bold and confident moments before, now found themselves trapped. They were caught between the deadly rifle of the rancher in the cabin and the silent, menacing line of warriors on the ridge. Their hunt had turned into a trap, with them as the prey. Chief Black Eagle raised his hand and a hail of arrows, silent and deadly, rained down on the posse. The men screamed, scrambling for cover, their organized attack dissolving into pure panic. They were no longer a posse. They were a terrified mob. In the cabin, Jedediah watched, his mind reeling. He was saved, but he had a dreadful feeling his problems had just multiplied. Black Eagle's warriors would see a white man's cabin, surrounded by other white men, and his daughter nowhere in sight. They would assume the worst. They would assume he was her captor, the one responsible for her disappearance. From the cellar, Ayanna knew she had to act. This was her moment. The man who had saved her was about to be killed by the man who had raised her. A terrible, tragic irony. She pushed open the cellar door and scrambled out into the bullet-riddled cabin. Jedediah turned, his eyes wide with alarm. "Get down!" he yelled, but she ignored him. She ran to the door, unbarred it, and threw it open. She stepped out onto the porch, into the sunlight, her hands raised high. The fighting stopped. A collective gasp went through the warriors on the ridge. The men of the posse stared, dumbfounded. Ayanna stood there, a small, defiant figure in the middle of a war zone, her gaze fixed on the chief at the head of the riders. "Father!" she cried out, her voice clear and strong, a mixture of her own tongue and the English word she had learned. Chief Black Eagle's stoic expression shattered, replaced by one of pure, unadulterated relief. He urged his horse forward down the ridge toward the cabin, but his eyes were not just on his daughter. They were on the tall, scarred white man who stood in the doorway behind her, his rifle still held at the ready. The battle with the posse was over. but the confrontation between the chief and the rancher had just begun. Chief Black Eagle dismounted, his warriors fanning out behind him, their weapons still aimed at the stunned and terrified members of the posse. Sheriff Brody and his men, including the bearded outlaws, dropped their guns, their bluster completely gone. The chief's eyes, hard as obsidian, were fixed on Jedediah. He saw a white man, armed, standing in a cabin that had clearly been the site of a battle. He saw his daughter, alive but in the heart of the enemy's world. He took a step toward the porch, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. Ayanna stepped between them, placing a hand on her father's chest. "No," she said in her own tongue. "This man, he is not the enemy. He is my protector." She turned to Jedediah, her eyes pleading with him to understand. Then she turned back to her father and began to speak, her voice rising with passion and clarity. She told him everything. She told him of the ambush by the men with beards, the ones who now cowered in the posse. She told him of her desperate flight, her collapse in the wilderness. Then she told him of the lone rancher who had found her, who had tended her wounds, who had shared his home, and who had just risked his life to defend her from the very men who had attacked them. As she spoke, she pointed to the outlaws. The bearded man's face went pale with terror. He knew he had been identified. He made a desperate move, lunging for a dropped pistol on the ground. He never made it. An arrow, fired from the bow of one of Black Eagle's warriors, sprouted from his shoulder, pinning him to the ground with a scream of agony. His companions surrendered instantly. Jedediah watched, his rifle still held loosely in his hands. He did not understand the words Ayanna spoke, but he understood her meaning. He saw the shift in Chief Black Eagle's expression, the hard fury slowly being replaced by a dawning understanding, and then a reluctant respect. The chief looked from his daughter's earnest face to the bullet-riddled cabin, then to the cowering forms of Sheriff Brody and the outlaws. He saw the truth. He looked at Jedediah, a long, appraising look. He saw the scars, the weariness, the unyielding strength in the rancher's winter sky eyes. He saw a man who, like himself, had known loss and had stood his ground. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a sign of friendship, not yet, but it was a sign of peace, an acknowledgement. Jedediah nodded back, lowering his rifle. The three-way standoff was over. In the quiet aftermath, surrounded by humbled lawmen and stoic warriors, the lone rancher and the great chief stood as two pillars of two different worlds, with the daughter of one and the savior of the other standing as the bridge between them. The cleanup was swift and decisive. Chief Black Eagle's warriors rounded up the outlaws and the remnants of Brody's posse. The law of redemption had been exposed as a corrupt and prejudiced sham. The chief declared that he would take the outlaws to the nearest army fort himself to see that true justice was done, the justice his daughter had been denied. Brody, stripped of his badge and his dignity, was sent back to town on foot, a message to all that a new order had been established on this patch of land. As the warriors prepared to leave, a difficult silence fell over the ranch. Ayanna stood with her father, her people. It was where she belonged. Jedediah stood on his porch, alone once more. The familiar emptiness of the cabin waiting behind him was a hollow, aching feeling. He had saved her, and now he had to lose her. He had known this was the inevitable end. He had prepared himself for it. But the preparation did nothing to dull the pain. Ayanna spoke with her father, her voice low and earnest. The chief listened, his gaze flickering between his daughter and the solitary rancher. Finally, he nodded. Ayanna walked across the dusty yard, back to the porch, back to Jedediah. "My father thanks you," she said, her English soft and clear. "He calls you man who stands alone. He says you have a strong heart." "You are going with them," Jedediah said. It was not a question. "They are my people," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "This is my home." She gestured to the vast mountains, to the sky. Then she looked at the small cabin, at him. "This is also my home." She took his calloused hand in hers. "I will return," she said, her voice a soft promise. "When the snow melts, I will see my family, heal my heart. Then I will return." Jedediah looked into her eyes and saw the truth of her words. He saw a future he had never dared to imagine. He saw a life beyond his ghosts. "I will be here," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. She squeezed his hand, then turned and walked back to her father. Chief Black Eagle looked at Jedediah one last time, and this time there was no reservation in his nod. It was a look of profound respect between two men who had almost been enemies, but who now shared an understanding deeper than words. Jedediah watched as they rode away, a proud, resilient people, with his morning star among them, until they were just specks on the horizon. He was alone again, but for the first time in 5 years he did not feel lonely. He felt hope. Winter came, blanketing the high country in a deep, silent layer of snow. Jedediah spent the long, cold months preparing. He repaired the bullet holes in his cabin, each patch a memory of the battle they had won. He expanded the small garden, tilling the hard soil, making it ready for spring. He built a new room onto the cabin, a small addition with its own window, a room for a person who might want a space of their own. His work was purposeful, driven by a hope that was a constant warm fire in his chest. It was no longer just surviving, he was building a life. He thought of her every day. He would sit by the fire and hold the small carved hawk she had given him, its smooth surface a tangible link to her promise. He practiced the words she had taught him, keeping her language alive in the silent cabin. He was a changed man. The profound, suffocating grief for his lost family had not vanished, but it had transformed. It was no longer an anchor holding him in the past, but a part of his story, a story that was still being written. The ghosts of Sarah and Thomas were still with him, but they were no longer specters of his failure. They were gentle memories, and he felt, in a way he could not explain, that they would be happy for him. They would want him to live. They would want him to love again. He was rediscovering the man he had been before the darkness came, a man who could feel joy, a man who could look at a sunrise and see not just the start of another day of labor, but the beauty of a new beginning. He was no longer just the man who stands alone. He was a man waiting for his heart to return. The first thaw of spring arrived and the world began to wake up. The snow receded, revealing the green shoots of new life. The creek, once dry, now gurgled with fresh, clear water from the melting ice. Jedediah found himself watching the horizon, his heart a mixture of anxious anticipation and unwavering faith. He scanned the distant pass every morning, every evening, looking for a sign. One afternoon, as the sun cast long golden shadows across the valley, he saw it, a single rider, moving steadily toward his ranch. It was not a war party. It was not a posse. He was a lone figure on a spotted pony. His heart leaped into his throat. He walked out from his porch, his feet moving on their own, his eyes fixed on the approaching rider. As she drew closer, he could see the details. It was her, Ayanna. She was dressed in beautifully beaded buckskin, her dark hair braided with ribbons of blue. She looked strong, healthy, and radiant. She looked like a princess, but her eyes were the same fierce, intelligent, defiant eyes that had captivated him from the moment he found her. She rode right up to him and dismounted, the grace and confidence in her movement taking his breath away. She stood before him, a small triumphant smile on her lips. "I told you I would return," she said. "I see you have been busy." She looked at the expanded garden, the new room on the cabin. "I was expecting you," he replied, his voice a low, happy rumble. They stood there for a long moment, simply looking at each other, the vast wilderness their witness. The chasm between their two worlds had been bridged, not by treaties or laws, but by a simple act of kindness, by shared courage, and by love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of places. She reached out and took his hand. "My father sends his greetings," she said. "He says the man who stands alone needs a companion to help him tend his garden." A grog, genuine smile broke across Jedediah's face, a smile that reached his winter sky eyes and chased away the last of the shadows. He squeezed her hand, his heart full to bursting. He had given shelter to a stranger, and in return, she had given him back his life. He was home. They were both home.